Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about Exchange Server. We're going to be talking about Office 365. Our very own Ben Bolte is presenting for us, so we're all looking forward to that. I just want to remind everybody that if you have any questions during the presentation, type them into the question box. We will call them out and get them answered. And this and every webinar is recorded and goes up onto our website, Innovia.com. So without further ado, Ben, I will hand it over to you.
All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about if you're still running Exchange Server on-premise and some thoughts about why you may want to move to a hosted solution. And if it's a hosted solution with us, we generally recommend Office 365. So we'll kind of go through that a little bit today. So just a brief introduction. My current role at Innovia Consulting is I work as a technology architect, so I work with our customers to help define and design cloud solutions for their business. Just from a little bit of a background perspective, I've been in the technology consulting business for 23 years now. I've done everything from being a system engineer and system admin for a large company internally, and moved over to the consulting world. So just a brief introduction here for those of you that are on the webinar that aren't familiar with Innovia Consulting. We'll kind of run through that quick. We'll also talk about why you ended up with Exchange on-premise originally, discuss some of the advantages of a hosted Exchange solution, kind of walk through the process of the migration to a hosted solution, and also what we can do along the way to help manage the risk during the migration. So who is Innovia Consulting? So, for those that have been around as a customer for a long time, we started out as ABC Computers a little over 30 years ago. And as the business has changed and consulting world of IT has changed, we felt a need for a rebranding effort. So we've gone through that to give something that's more related to what we really do on a day-to-day basis. We have a little over 50 staff members located throughout what I call the eastern half of the U.S., as you can see by the map, with 4 physical locations in the Midwest. Our headquarters in Onalaska, Wisconsin. We have an office up in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, which is where I'm from. We also have an office in Wapaka, Wisconsin, and then an office down in South Bend, Indiana. We always kind of like to give everyone an idea of some of the customers we work with and the diversity of both size and industry types. We work with companies like Culver's from the franchising perspective, Cat Plugs, who makes plugs for different molding processes and protection industry, Shep's Ice Cream, along with Bulldog Battery, Sarah's from a bike rack perspective, and just to give an idea of a few of the companies we work with. So, kind of going back to how do we get where we're at? So really what we see happens with history, everything that kind of looks back and repeats itself sooner or later. So really what people move to Exchange for is trying to get a better communication experience. Exchange helps keep you in touch by providing multiple options from the desktop client, a web-based client, and mobile devices. Everybody wants to have the exact same experience, no matter what device they're working from, and making sure that they have all of that synchronized in real time and that they can keep the history that they've done on one device with all their devices. Increased productivity, being able to get access to your email, contacts, calendar, and tasks from anywhere on any device is what drove people to Exchange in the first place. Sharing calendars and contacts with other members, being able to set up meetings and those type of things are all core functions that you use on a day-to-day perspective in most of our businesses. Going back, professional appearance. For those that have been around a while, you may remember when email was starting in from a business perspective, a lot of us had different Hotmail or Gmail or different accounts like that, or maybe if you're really old school, you had an AOL online account. But there was this whole education or change of, if you wanted to be professional, you had to have your own domain. So there's been that whole revelation, like if you don't have that, there's just an image that goes with it. And, better collaboration in general. So, Exchange isn't just about the email. You can share documents, calendar, tasks with other people in your organization and outside your organization. So, the common thread here is communication. Everybody wants to go from, the image on the left over to the right. You want a more professional system. And I think that initial change of trying to get to a more professional system is really what, in my mind, leads to what a hosted solution can do for you with Exchange. Email used to be a nice to have in a business perspective. Now when I meet with customers and we take a list of their line of business applications and the applications they use on a daily basis in their business, email will 90% of the time come up as one of the top 2 or 3 applications in their organization. And in a lot of organizations, it is number 1. It's the common thread from a ordering perspective, communication with customers and vendors that we all use on a daily basis, and the need for it to be 100% uptime, reliable solution is more apparent now than ever. And if you'd have done that same exercise 5 or 10 years ago, the phone system was always the number 1 thing. Our phones have to work. It's changed that while the phone might be in the top 10, it usually isn't in the top 5 from an application or feature or function perspective that most companies are relying upon. So when you start looking at the advantages of a hosted Exchange solution, there's a bunch of them. The one that jumps out number 1 is financial investment. The cost involved with building out and maintaining an Exchange system is usually a lot higher than most people think. So you have not only the licensing perspective, you have the server perspective, the management side of it. Someone has to maintain that. And then there's the third-party add-ons that most companies deal with, whether it's spam, filtering, archiving, or legal hold type features. This is stuff that all adds to that total cost of ownership. IT resources. While it takes time to do it, it's very hard to quantify how much time really gets spent managing your Exchange system if you have it on-premise. With a hosted solution, you don't have any of that cost. You're paying a simple monthly fee on a per-user basis. If you don't have the users, you don't pay for it. From a deployment perspective, there's always a migration cost with Exchange, whether you're going from the old versions like a small business server that had Exchange 2003 or 7 or 10. There's always a migration cost and the initial deployment cost. With a hosted solution, you have a migration cost, but that's a one and done fee. Once you're migrated to the platform, it's the hosting company's responsibility to take care of the upgrades, the maintenance, and reliability. Security, this is one of the areas that's often overlooked from not only an expense perspective, but just from a time and maintenance perspective. As Exchange and email has gotten more important, security certificates to make sure that your encryption and those type of things that you're trying to do are all functioning and working, that all adds more layers. Upgrades, we talked about this a little bit already, but upgrading from one version of Exchange to the other isn't always easy, and there's always cost of that, whether it's a server operating system, the license and CALs for Exchange, all that ties in. And then, as we talked before, being that it needs to be reliable, 24/7, 365 support is critical of a system that you need to rely on. Most small businesses don't have the skill set, aren't willing to invest in the expense and all those pieces to provide a true 24/7, 100% uptime type of solution. With an Office 365 platform or something like that, most hosting partners will provide 99 point some percent guaranteed uptime. And with Office 365, it's financially backed to be 99.9%. They have physical redundancy in every layer, both from a physical perspective, but also functional and geographic. So if their data center would take a hit, there's always a redundant data center that has your data in that will keep you up and running. And last but not least, they have financially backed SLAs. So, what's the last time your system was down? Not only was it down, you took a hit from the cost perspective of somebody having to try to fix it, but you also take the hit that your customers, you could have lost business. Maybe they couldn't get a hold of you and took the order somewhere else. So the importance of that uptime is just, it's huge and often, not totally considered while looking at your on-premise solution versus a hosted. So, what we really want to talk about today is when you've made the mindset change that you may want to move this out, back to the cloud, so to speak. It really comes down to making it risk-free. Now, I'd love to tell you that you can make a migration from one solution to another, and it'll be 100% risk-free. The fact of the matter is, it won't be. It's not 100%. But there's a lot of steps that we do during migrations to help minimize that risk and making it as low, or the percentage of risk-free, so to speak, as high as possible. So, I want to walk through some of the steps that we do as a company when we're working on a migration from an on-premise Exchange environment to a hosted solution. So we run an assessment risk report, and what it will do is it goes through and documents your Exchange server properties, all the mailboxes that are in use, all the different user properties, discover the mailbox permissions that are set by Active Directory per user. It'll walk through some of the retention policies, distribution lists, public folders, look at the mobile devices that are connecting, and look at the mailbox sizes and quotas that you have set, and evaluate how that needs to be addressed going forward. Now, as with any application, when you're going through an upgrade process, you got to understand what version you're coming from, what version you're going to, and understand, as with any application, there are always some features that come and go based upon use, and making sure that some of that stuff is taken into place. So the tool that we run will go through and look at what version of Exchange you're running currently. It'll look at the number of mailboxes, how many users are enabled or disabled, total mailbox size, your number of distribution lists, and the retention policies that you have in place. Now, in most cases, these are things that have been set up by either your IT staff or your IT provider, but it might have been 5, it might have been 10 years ago, and remembering some of these things is the difficult part, and those are the pieces that make the whole migration, add that risk factor, because most of us don't have a very well documented implementation, because it's usually adjusted over the years so much. So our tool will go through and actually get a list of all of your users, the usernames, and the quotas, how much they're actually using, and get you all that detail so you can plan it properly. Now, some of that is a big deal because you have to understand how much data you have to migrate out. Now, we have a tool that we use. We'll kind of go through some of the details of that later, but depending on how much data you have to migrate, it it adjusts how much time you need to synchronize your existing Exchange database to your Office 365 Exchange database. We also do an assessment of the policies that you have in place. Some companies have no policies for Exchange, some have a lot. So sometimes, depending upon the user or the type of user you have in the company, you may have different deletion processes or policies in place of how many days you can keep a deleted item and restore. So all that goes into play when we're going through this assessment, because if those are policies you want to maintain, we have to recreate those in Office 365. Another piece that we're seeing become a bigger factor in our migrations than ever before is the mobile phone side of things. As everybody and their brother now has a smartphone, we find that people are using them. Well, the problem is, depending upon users, you're going to need to send them directions or help them through so that when you do this migration, they know how to either reset up their client or they understand what's involved. And from an IT perspective, understanding how many devices are really syncing and what devices they are. So this mobile device report that we run will give you all of the operating systems from a mobile perspective that are currently synchronizing. So in our case here, we had some stuff going to an iOS 8.3, Android 4.42, iOS 7.1 to Windows Phone 8.1, some other Android versions, some older versions of Windows Phone. And also I'll tell you device specific, so you might have a specific model of Android or iPhone, and understanding where that plays in and what upgrades you may want to do for what's supported for that device. So building on it here, it shows you the exact model of the phone, when it was last synced, because let's face it, part of the world we live in, devices change. So if people might have had 2 or 3 different smartphones over the last year or two, and you can see when they were last synced, so maybe this particular phone doesn't matter anymore, but these other ones do. That's all stuff to keep in mind as we're going through the migration. And then the other thing that's always interesting is, how much is the user actually really using? Are they syncing multiple folders? That all comes into play as you help that user get reset up. There's some of those options that they might need that you're not going to think about by default, so to speak. Distribution lists. This is one of those areas that we find the most, in my mind, simple, but it comes up to be sometimes the most difficult part of the puzzle of migration. So a lot of times when we work through with a customer, we figure out which distribution list exists and who the members are, and who the members are and who they should be are oftentimes two different things, because people come and go, roles change within organizations, and sometimes there's a lot more work involved with cleaning this assessment, or this part of the assessment, up on the distribution list than some of the other areas, because it's just one of those areas that we see that's oftentimes not maintained that well. So then another thing that's very interesting, and this goes back to how well your stuff is documented, is a mailbox permission report. And what we typically run this on a by user basis to figure out if there's stuff that's been shared off between users. Some of this stuff will migrate correctly and some doesn't migrate, and we have to understand what we need to resync after the project is done or throughout the project as we go along. Some of the things that's really common is most people, or a lot of people within a company, will share their calendars, but the level of permission they share to the calendars may or may not be complete. It might just be detail or subject line level. Some might be more detail. Some may be full details. Some people allow you to add directly to their calendars. This stuff is all taken into place here, so we can make sure that when we get you migrated, that you have the same type of permissions that you had in the past. And if not, that the people or users understand how they can recreate some of that stuff if they want it. The other piece that we'll go through here is it'll give us the ability to set up your archive warnings for your quota sizes and some of those other functions like that with public folders to make sure we have everything in the same position when we're done with the migration as we started it in. And then the other big thing that we run into that really seems to cause some headaches along the way, and this is usually one of those missed areas, is integrations. We see a lot of what we would call a copier, scanner, or multifunction devices that have become very prevalent in the business world. These all link or email through your Exchange server, in most cases, some way, shape, or form. So during the project, we need to figure out which devices are using that functionality. We have to go through, and this can be done ahead of time in most cases. We can change the authentication so that it's authenticating through Office 365 to do your email instead of your internal Exchange server. But those are all pieces of the puzzle you have to figure out along the way. If you have very old devices, sometimes this becomes an issue in that they don't have some of the newer security functions. It might just be an IP address instead of an authentication type of setup. And if that's the case, sometimes we have to recreate an internal SMTP server just to do that email function for you. Similar along that line is the line of business applications. I mean, we deal with it with nav quite a bit, but you also see it with CRM and reporting servers that are using your current Exchange email server for that actual sending of your messages or your reports. That stuff all needs to be reconfigured to use the new server. This is one of those areas that, you know, it's homework that needs to be done ahead of time, because you can migrate and everyone will be working like you think they should, only to find when you turn off your or deprovision the Exchange server, stuff starts to break. So we like to do as much homework as we can ahead of time. And then, you know, to my point earlier, nothing's 100% risk-free. So, you know, those are some of those areas you just need to be ready for when they do come up. If there's a specific app or something you guys didn't think about, or that didn't come up through the assessment process. Spam tools is one we run into a lot of times, where companies will work with a third party or a hosted spam service. These tools become redundant with Office 365 since it's built into Office 365. So, you know, we got to take those out of place in some cases, figure out how that works. There are some customers that we work with that like the spam tool they have, and we'll sometimes work together to maintain those if they feel a need for. And the other one that we run into more often than anything that people sometimes want to keep is if they have an archive or legal hold feature that they're using with a third-party product. Some companies will keep those in place because the particular Office 365 plan they chose might not have that feature built in and they wanted to maintain it. I mean, there's certainly features that you can have with Office 365, but not everybody does, depending on the plan they're on. So, as I said earlier, I want to walk through the whole migration process once. So, from a user perspective, we try to make it as painless as possible. So, what starts out is we go through a web planning tool, and that's where we'll run some of these assessments, and we'll work with the end user to figure out the piece that we were describing earlier. So which users do we need to migrate? Which plan does each user need to be on? Any unique permissions, aliases, multiple domains, all of those type of functions we work on ahead of time. Once we get through the plan and assign all those users to them, either we push out what's called a Skykick assistant tool, or we'll send out like an email to each user so that they can install it. It can be done either way. What this tool does is it goes on each person's PC and it's set up so that it will recreate their Outlook profile at the point of migration. So once that tool gets installed on the user's PC, it goes through a early sync process. So it'll sync all of the data from your on-premise Exchange server over to Office 365 prior to the actual data or the MX record cutover date, so to speak. What this does is to make sure that when you do the swing from your on-premise Exchange server to Office 365, that it's as clean a cut as possible. At the point that sync process gets started, it will tell you an estimated date that you can do your cutover. In a small organization, 20 to 25 users, it can be as low as a day or maybe two. In some very large organizations we've done migrations for, it's taken a couple of weeks to sync because of the amount of data. So that all comes into play as this goes through. At the point of migration, so in the example here, we often do this on a Friday, like an end of business day type of deal, but we will have it so that the SkyKick tool at 5 o'clock, if your user's working in Outlook, they're going to get a little pop-up window that will tell them, hey, your company's chosen Office 365, they're doing Exchange migration, we're doing the actual live cutover at this point, and we need you to close Outlook for a few minutes, and once it's completed, we'll let you know. So it'll close Outlook, it reconfigures your Outlook profile so that your new profile will point to Office 365 instead of your internal server, and it will reopen Outlook when it's done, or prompt you to reopen it, and at that point you will have all the same data that you had a minute ago, but it'll now be on the Office 365 server, along with maintaining your NK2 file, so your quick file or quick emails addresses when you start to type in the to field will automatically pop. All your global address lists, all that stuff will be replicated that you had before, along with public folders, etc. The only piece that you are left manually, so to speak, to do is on the mobile phones. So on the phones, at that point, you have to recreate your Outlook profile or Exchange profile, and the user will enter their email address and their password, and it will resync on their mobile phones. Depending upon the OS, whether it's Windows, Android, or iOS, the user will get an email that has step-by-step directions on how they can do it on each of those platforms, so it makes it as simple as possible for them. And then the piece that in the past was always kind of a tricky area is you can't completely control how quickly the DNS and MX records replicate throughout the internet. So what the SkyKick tool does is it will continue to compare your old Exchange server and your new hosted Exchange server in Office 365 to ensure that any new messages that came in after that sync process will get forwarded on to Office 365, so you have those without any interruption. And then after a period of time, I believe it's around 72 hours, that sync process will stop once it's all completed. But at a high level, that's kind of how it works. So at this point, I'd like to open up for questions. If there's any that came in, Abby.
Okay, great, Ben. We do have a couple of questions. Our first question, how much does it cost to have a user in Office 365?
Okay, that's a great question. So we get asked this all the time. A standard Exchange user, like your typical user has in their current environment, from an on-premise perspective, starts as low as $4 a month per user. If you have users that are in a production floor type of application, or like what I call more of a, or Microsoft refers to as a kiosk user, so they're using a shared device they're not using Outlook, but they're actually using Outlook Web Access. Those type of users can start as low as $2 a month per user.
Our next question, Ben, you had mentioned spam protection. Is that included as part of Office 365?
Yes, so what's built into Office 365 has gone through several rebrandings, but basically it's called Forefront Protection for Exchange. It includes spam filtering, your antivirus filtering, and all that, and it's monitored and maintained by Microsoft engineers, and you have the ability as an administrator on your domain to go in and add your own whitelist or blacklist if you want to. And in addition to that, within Office 365, it also will look at what it allowed through and will come up with what it suggests as a junk email if something comes through that it believes you aren't going to want. And in addition, in Office 365, they recently have added a feature called Clutter, which will look at what's known as legit good email that based upon the user's actual activities and use of Outlook, it'll start prioritizing some of that as clutter, and that's totally customizable by user. And what we find is it works fairly well for most users, and it'll look at your habits of what email you look at. Maybe you get an email that you're included in as part of a distribution group that you never open because it really doesn't pertain to you, but you're just part of that list. It figures that stuff out and will automatically put in clutter. If it doesn't figure it out on its own, you have the ability to drag it into that clutter folder, and then in the future it'll continue to work off of that process that you created for it.
And our final question here, Ben, can we start with just Exchange Online and add other pieces as we get more comfortable with Microsoft's cloud services?
Absolutely. That's probably the most common thing we see. As companies are moving to the cloud, what we see is while there are some that just, for lack of better terms, make the big jump and dive in head over heels and move everything, most companies we see are making what I call a strategic slow step approach. Email is probably the easiest entry point to the cloud that there is. It starts out because email's by nature in the cloud to begin with. So moving your Exchange server or your email server to the cloud just seems natural from that perspective. And it gets people comfortable with the services it offers. And what we see and what Microsoft sees is once they get used to that experience and they see it works good and the cost benefits of it, they start adding additional features like SharePoint or OneDrive for Business, Skype for Business, Yammer, all those other type of tools that are part of the Office 365 family that might not have been part of the initial plan that you purchased, but you have the ability to switch between plans on a monthly basis. So as you get more comfortable and you want to expand your functionality in the cloud, that ability is there for you on a monthly basis to make those changes. So if that's all the questions I have, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining today, and feel free to reach out to myself at Innovia or any of our other account managers for questions or concerns, and we'd be there to help them.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, and we hope to see everyone on our next webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.